Today we'll be discussing the career of the late filmmaker David Lynch, and we'll be discussing emphysema. This is Doctor versus Comedian. I'm Dr. Asif, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Not a real doctor.
Ali Hassan. Every episode I pick a topic for Ali from comedy and entertainment, and I question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic from medicine and health and grills me on that topic. Now, groundbreaking director David Lynch passed away recently, so today we'll be reviewing his life and his career. And of course, Lynch died from complications from emphysema. So in our second half, we'll be discussing that disease. But before we get started, Ali needs to get something off his chest, apparently.
Well, it's like, as it is, David Lynch, misunderstood by many, appreciated by many, and I'm both of those camps. I appreciate him and I misunderstand him. Doing a deep dive on his life sort of helped. I wanted to rewatch a few movies. Guess what happens on Amazon when you want to rewatch movies of somebody who's died?
Like who's recently died?
Who's recently died.
Not available?
Available, but now it's going to cost you, even though you have a membership and it was free a week ago, but now everything's... So this is just like a little commentary on Amazon in general. They love to exploit people in every way, including exploiting death of people. Also, in Quebec recently, they formed a union at Amazon. They shut down, rather than give workers any rights, they shut it down completely. They're out of Quebec. And then, when some people were striking, I think it was in December in Pennsylvania, they turned on the water to flood outside where they were picketing peacefully and all that, just to make it like cold and damp and wet their shoes and that kind of stuff in cold December weather. This is a company run by an idiot turd. And we're all suckers, and I wish I could and we're at a place in my house where we go, you know what? Before you buy anything on Amazon, take a look. What do you got to wait 5 days to buy it somewhere else? What is it? $5-10 more somewhere else? Do it. Anything I can do to not pay that guy money. I keep the subscription for us. This is what I do for you, Asif.
Oh, thank you.
This is the sacrifice I make so that we can watch.
One of my friends, Brad, just texted me the other day. He said, I seen this movie, Brad. Union. I said, no, what's it about? He said, it's a Canadian documentary about the efforts of Amazon workers to unionize in New Jersey, which they did, making it the first union at the company.
Yes.
But he said, interestingly, guess what? The documentary has not been picked up for distribution.
Is that interesting, or is that completely 100% on brand? Anybody who doesn't support workers' rights, you have to be at the very least, suspicious of them. Yeah. So Amazon can suck a huge fat egg as far as I'm concerned. And now we start. So all that to say, I'm not as well equipped for this because I didn't want to pay $14.99 plus $4.99 plus $19.99 for 3 different movies that I would have loved to have watched over the last week. I could have watched them illegally. I hear people do that from time to time, and I'm inclined to do it. And then, of course, they'll all complain about people do this stuff illegally. Like, who do you think drove me to this?
But by the way, speaking of not watching something illegally, so Union, that movie, apparently you can go to the website and pay money and then stream it yourself. So perhaps people should do that to support them. And this idea of going directly to the creators to stream something, you pay them, it's actually going to come up later with our discussion of David Lynch. So let's get going.
Oh, good. I thought it was going to come up later with our discussion of emphysema. I'm like, no, what happened? Who did what? Okay, David Lynch, an absolute icon of cinema. We're in an interesting place because normally a director, the Spielbergs of the world, the Soderberghs, I want to say Sondheims. Steven Soderbergh of the world. But Stevens. Isn't that interesting?
Not really.
It's not.
Continue.
No, not at all. Not in the least bit. It'd be very difficult to go through all their movies. David Lynch has a pretty limited, exclusive sort of list of films here. He didn't do a ton. TV even less so. But they leave a real imprint.
Yeah.
And so let's get into it. Yeah.
10 feature-length movies. and then his series, which we will talk about. Yeah, let's talk about David Lynch. You know what? I think we will do things somewhat differently today. Usually we don't go in chronological order, but I think we should, just because, as you said, Ali, he has a relatively limited filmography, so we'll have time to go through. We don't have to talk about a lot of them in detail, but we can if we want. And we'll just touch on the beginning, maybe just some interesting trivia about his life, but let's talk about his awards. So he has been nominated for 3 Academy Awards for Best Director, 1 for Best Adapted Screenplay. He's won the César Award for Best Foreign Film in France. He's won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival. He's won the Golden Lion for a Lifetime Achievement of the Venice
They do love
Film
him
Festival.
in that part of the world. I feel like if I was more European, I would be even more of a David Lynch fan.
Well, let's get into that. We'll talk about some of the reception for some of his movies in a second.
Well, you know what? Interesting. You might have come across this in the reading, but pretend to ignore it if you did.
Yeah.
Knowing David Lynch, knowing his work, what do you think would be like one of his favorite films?
Yes, I would think it would be avant-garde French New Wave cinema type thing.
Hilarious, right? Or if I told you Clockwork Orange or something was his favorite, you'd be like, oh yeah, sure, something like pretty wild, experimental. It's actually his absolute favorite, one that he referenced quite frequently, The Wizard of Oz. Mm-hmm. The 1939 Wizard of Oz, which just serves to make him even more interesting to me, and to be quite honest.
He's such a fascinating person. A couple other things that were interesting. You know, he lived in Philadelphia early on in his life, and he didn't have a lot of money. He went to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He went to a couple different places for school.
A lot of leaving of places as well.
Yeah, moving, leaving. And he said he lived in the bad neighborhoods. They were robbed, shot at. And this feeling of danger and fear was there all the time. And he said that city of Philadelphia was the biggest influence in his whole life. And so it's the same thing as A Wizard of Oz in a sense that now that you know that, you can look and you can see some of these things in his films and you're like, this is why he can create tension in a even innocuous scene so well. It's unbelievable. I was rewatching some of his movies this past week, and this tension is because he felt that living in the mean streets of Philadelphia.
And he says something about Philadelphia. He says there was violence and hate and filth, but the biggest influence in my whole life was that city. Very, very interesting, right? Like sometimes you see that, you grew up with that, and you don't want to have anything to do with it. You want to run from it. You want to have it be the furthest thing from your mind. He did the old use it.
So let's talk about, he did make some short films, but the first film that really put him on the map was Eraserhead. It is super disturbing. And he didn't know what to do at the beginning. He was thinking about making an animated film, and then his friends kind of convinced him to do this. Friends being Jack Fisk, who's a production designer, who's one of his best friends, and his wife is, of course, Sissy Spacek. So these are, his friends for years, since the 60s. He got a grant to do it, and then he basically made this film. People haven't seen it. Extremely disturbing, very out there. And this is, I think, him putting the exclamation point on, this is what I am as a filmmaker. We'll talk about what happened afterwards. But so it tells the story of this guy, Henry, who lives in kind of a dystopian wasteland, and his girlfriend gives birth to a deformed baby. And that's probably all you really need to know or can understand from the movie.
And she splits. She splits is an important part of it too.
Yeah. And he raises the baby. Yeah, exactly. And he calls this his Philadelphia story. And I had no idea, right? Like the disturbing images. It's hard for me to watch that movie in full. I've seen more clips of it because I do find it super disturbing. But the admiration for that movie when it came out, nobody had seen a movie like this, like when it came out. Kubrick said it was one of his favorite films of all time. And then Mel Brooks, he saw a screening of this. He came out and he gave Lynch a big hug and said, "You're a madman. I love you." And even to this day, Mel Brooks, he penned something on Instagram about, his admiration for David Lynch. He's been a collaborator of his for years. And, which you don't usually associate Mel Brooks with David Lynch, but
a comedic madman.
He had so much respect for him. So yeah, that's Eraserhead.
What I love is that I highlight things in green for myself to say, and you seem to think that means you should read them with more passion than ever.
Sorry, I will. I apologize.
Maybe you should highlight some things. You told me. I didn't tell you. You told me highlight things in the script. Anyway, that's fine.
Well, let's move on. So, in fact, Mel Brooks had a production company, and they were looking for a director for The Elephant Man, and then they approached David Lynch. And so that's why he did and this is the story of a man, Joseph Merrick, who had these physical deformities. They say, we could do a whole episode on this. They say he had neurofibromatosis type 1, but some other people think he actually may have had Proteus syndrome, a different syndrome. It doesn't really matter. He had the severe physical deformities, and he was in a sideshow, and then he gets under the care of a surgeon, Frederick Treves, and that's played by Anthony Hopkins in the movie. And again, it's an interesting movie. It's filmed in black and white as well, but it's actually a very conventional film. It follows a typical conventional, plot. But it was a huge hit. Many, many nominations at the Oscars. But it's interesting. So he kind of did hit the avant-garde one that put him on the map, and then a much more conventional film for his follow-up.
George Lucas, also a huge fan of Elephant Man, as we're talking about the various people. I mean, the list is probably very long. But he was a fan of Eraserhead to the point where he said, would you, David Lynch, like to direct a little film I'm doing called Return of the Jedi? And David Lynch said, nuh-uh.
Yeah, so he passed. And then I don't know what happened, but he kind of reconsidered doing the, Hollywood blockbuster movies because he did Dune, right? I think people know Dune. It's a bit of a complicated thing because he did not get final cut of the movie, which is something he basically insisted upon for his further movies. And so it was a studio movie, and he had to make all these compromises, and he didn't really like it. So a lot of his footage was removed from the theatrical cut. So some people say it doesn't make sense. They later released an extended version without his permission, which he also hated. He said he wanted the Alan Smithy, Alan Smithy. Do you know what that is?
What is it?
So a director doesn't want to have their name attached to it. They'll say directed by Alan Smithy. There's a whole documentary about the Alan Smithy name and why people choose to do that. So Dune was a bit disappointing. I think there are still people who love it. There are still people who think it's better than Denis Villeneuve's remake of Dune. But I think it was limited by studio kind of interference.
I saw the Dune. I haven't seen these Dunes, the Dunes of which we speak about these days.
Which ones are you talking? You've seen the original. Okay, so yeah, what were your
I've
thoughts?
only seen the original.
You haven't seen the new ones, yeah.
And I remember liking it. And I also remember not knowing it was created by David Lynch.
Oh, really?
That was not a thing that I knew at all.
I only knew that after the fact as well. Once I got into David Lynch, I'll talk to you about when in this timeline I started watching his movies and TV shows. That's very interesting that that's the case. And of course, who else was in that movie? Not just Kyle MacLachlan, who, of course, huge collaborator with David Lynch, but your good buddy, Gordon Sumner.
Oh, yeah.
Sting.
Stingy McStingenstein.
Yes,
Yeah.
That's right. Okay, so then after Dune, he does this movie Blue Velvet, which I think is this is now, I think, the pathway for David Lynch going on, is this type of movie, Blue Velvet. So such a fascinating movie. It revolves on this college student, again played by Kyle MacLachlan, who comes home, and a lot of his movies start off with something like it's like a mystery, something unusual. So he discovers a severed ear in a field just as he's walking by. And why is there an ear there? How did they get there? What happens with it? And he kind of starts investigating this crime himself with his friend, Sandy, played by Laura Dern, another person who's appeared in many movies of David Lynch. And then he discovers that there's basically a criminal gang led by a guy named Frank Booth, played by Dennis Hopper. I won't get into spoilers of what happens, and he has this very abusive relationship with this woman, Dorothy, played by Isabella Rossellini. This was Isabella Rossellini's.
Yeah. So those four names that you've mentioned, phenomenal actors, have had great careers. I think Dennis Hopper already had a great career before Blue Velvet. Isabella Rossellini, I'm sure she was getting quite well known already at that time. But yeah, it does speak to the type of actors he could pull in and who wanted to work with him and who saw he was a genius, which is furthers my intention to figure out what this man is doing. Like, I know I saw something amazing, but why was it amazing? What is he doing? And most often I'm like, I don't really understand what happened. But Blue Velvet, I did. And Blue Velvet, the style of it was so interesting that I took note of who the director is. And Blue Velvet was probably the first time I
Did you think you saw
David
it around
Lynch.
the time it came out? So the time 86. So you
No,
it was much later.
on
Yeah, me too.
VHS years later.
Yeah, me too. And so it's such an interesting movie because, like I said, this is the style of David Lynch. There's a mystery, there's some violence at the beginning, a crime. Okay, that's interesting, but it's quite a normal, in quotation marks, movie until Dennis Hopper's character appears. He has that gas mask he keeps inhaling, and like what is this? There's a scene where it completely changes, and then there's an even crazier scene where they go to a party. And of course, you have Dean Stockwell doing some lip syncing to Roy Orbison, Roy Orbison's song "In Dreams." It's like a nightmare scenario that he creates on the screen, and that's what I love about David Lynch. Is it can be sort of normal and then just unbelievable. You read some of the reviews of Dennis Hopper and Isabella Rossellini's performance. People are like, these aren't even like actors; they're like inhabiting this crazy insanity. They're unbelievable in this movie. And like, as you said, this really shows the potential for David Lynch. So then everybody was like, what is going to happen next? What's the next thing for David Lynch after this? And of course, the next thing was
Twin Peaks. Then he went into television.
Which seems like, again, and he did this with Mark Frost, who kind of worked on shows like Hill Street Blues. So like kind of like typical, dramatic, very good shows. Yeah. And so he created Twin Peaks. So did you watch Twin Peaks during when it was on, reruns? How were you exposed to it?
The people who loved Twin Peaks were the losers in high school, the people who I did not like in general. What I mean by that is their musical tastes and their fashion sense and all. I just didn't like the Twin Peaks, so it kept me from watching it. Now, that's very judgmental of me and ridiculous, and I missed out on something great at the time. But it was like very simple. When you're that young, you're like, hey, if I watch this show, then these are the people who I'm going to have to talk to about this show, right? It was water cooler culture. You can't wait to tell your friends about what you saw. And I was like, my nearest and dearest friends aren't watching this. I got to go hang with these dudes. That's going to suck. So yeah, I did not watch it at the time. I came to it years later.
Yeah, interesting. Like, so me too. One of my friends was a huge fan, especially he liked some of the women in it, Lara Flynn Boyle, Sherilyn Fenn, who were amazing in it. And so in Canada and in the US, I believe, a couple years later, it would rerun on Bravo TV. And it would be in kind of the afternoon, like 4 or 5 p.m. And that's when I started rewatching it. And I watched every episode after that because it actually concluded by then. And so you could just watch all the episodes in a row, which was a great way to watch. So it's kind of like, it's what we would do in terms of streaming now, right? I loved this movie. In fact, what happened first is I watched the movie with my friends because they watched the series. We went and watched the prequel movie, Fire Walk With Me. And then I watched that with them. It's very confusing, especially if I haven't watched the show. And then we kind of went back, and then I kind of went back and watched it. It's crazy, even the concept of the show, right?
It is. Again, the direction, the directorial choices. I remember I would have been about, I think I've said this on the podcast, I would have been about 20 or 21 when the first person said to me, he loved this movie because whoever was directing it. And I remember thinking, who cares who directed it? What does that have to do with anything? I remember, actually, I would have been early university, so 19. And by the time I had graduated university, I was like, well, that was a stupid thing I said a few years ago, right? As you figure out, like, the more you hear directors' names, you start going like, why is everyone talking about Brian De Palma? Why is everyone talking about this person, this person? You get to understand a little bit more about what it is that a director does, what directorial choices are, what somebody else in that exact seat would have done differently. And I really felt that when I got to finally watch Twin Peaks. I was like, these are such interesting choices.
Right. And, it came up with this idea that Lynch and Frost had this idea of a corpse washing on a lakeshore in a Pacific Northwest town, right? And that's what they came up with. And of course,
again, this time not an ear, a corpse floats up, as you say.
And so again, it starts with a mystery, similar to Blue Velvet, and it's Laura Palmer. who passed away, and then a special agent, Dale Cooper, shows up in town to try and
Kyle MacLachlan,
discover what happened. The most interesting thing about this show is that, people loved it. There was a mystery aspect, and people, again, I think they remember the ending of the show. So they think it's all weird and supernatural and crazy stuff and the red curtains, but that's not what the show was about. We have the coffee shop. We have all the players in the town and how they interact with each other. And people forget about that with David Lynch. I think it's easy to just think about the Eraserhead and the crazy scenes from some of his movies, but you forget about the humanity. And that's what one of my friends, Brad, who I mentioned at the beginning, he mentioned that to me this past week after David Lynch died via text. He was saying, there's so much humanity and empathy in David Lynch's work that people gloss over and just think, it's just little people talking in reverse and things like that. It's so much more than that. And again, people forget how much people love Twin Peaks.
Well, David Lynch is quoted as saying about Twin Peaks that this project, the idea behind it was to mix a police investigation with the ordinary lives of characters.
Right.
That's what it is at its heart, right? It's not about the supernatural, extraordinary,
and that comes
strange stuff. That did, and I remember that making me a little bit uncomfortable because you get used to a rhythm of normal, and then I just wasn't able to break out of it. If it's abnormal from the beginning, I have no issue, but just I remember that being uncomfortable for me as a viewer, and why I took note again. I'll go, that's David Lynch. Okay, I get it now. This guy's crazy.
I guess was forced. He being Lynch was forced to reveal the killer's identity earlier than he wanted to. The network made him do it. And he says that's one of his biggest regrets in his career because, of course, after that, then the show moved days of the week and then it was eventually canceled after a ratings drop. And then it was kind of not concluded, so that's why he ended up making Fire Walk with Me, and we'll talk about the continuation of the series from a few years ago a bit later. So after Twin Peaks again, people were wondering what was going to be the next thing, and again, we'll skip over a few things, but then he did Wild at Heart. This movie is so interesting because he puts in these motifs of the Wizard of Oz in it, which I didn't really remember till I read about it. So this is a road movie. It's Nicolas Cage and Laura Dern involved in lots of crime. I didn't find it as strange as, say, Blue Velvet or some parts of Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. It's a bit more of crime, but it's very disturbing. It's funny at times, but very violent and disturbing at other points. It was, I think, a critical success. I'm not sure how much of a success it was with.
Well, this is one of the ones that I don't know if it got panned, but it was not really, there wasn't much of a response on this side of the old globe, but this is the one that won the Palme d'Or. You were talking about, the awards he's won. This movie won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival in 1990. And when it won, I find this very interesting, and I have some memory of this. Audience members booed the film, and they booed David Lynch when it won the prize. And one of the people who booed was Roger Ebert, famed movie critic. He admitted that on Letterman.
And it's very interesting. I seem to recall from my reading that Gene Siskel loved David Lynch, but Roger Ebert did not. And it took a while for Roger Ebert to come around for David Lynch. And we'll talk about, I think it was Mulholland Drive that eventually he said, like, no.
Sure. By the way, since you've mentioned it, this is what I wanted to watch this week. Mulholland Drive rewatch, Wild at Heart rewatch. I just remember really loving Nicolas Cage's acting. And I wanted to watch the first episode of Twin Peaks again. Those are the three things that would have cost me about $34, I think, if the math.
Well, we'll get to Mulholland Drive in a second. In fact, you know what you should do? You should come to Ottawa. One of our local repertory cinemas is doing David Lynch, one of his movies every week for the next few months.
Few months. I'm in.
Yeah, so
I'm in. I'm coming to Ottawa twice, actually.
So maybe you'll catch one of those. So after this, he did a couple other movies. He did The Straight Story, which is easily his most straightforward. I mean, it's called The Straight Story.
Ironically, I'd never even heard of it.
Really interesting. So
no,
I was trying to remember if I saw it or my friend just told me about it, but I'm pretty sure I saw it back in the 90s. It is a story about this guy, a true story. This guy, Alvin Straight. That's why it's called The Straight Story, played by Richard Farnsworth in a very critically acclaimed role. And he has to go visit his sick brother. and he goes on a 300-mile journey, and the only way to get there is by going on a riding lawnmower. And this is a very straightforward
Sounds
film.
beautiful.
It was actually written by Mary Sweeney, who is David Lynch's partner and was his partner at the time. And so maybe perhaps that's part of it, connecting with your partner, something that they're very passionate about. But do you know what it was rated by the Motion Picture Association of America?
Do not.
G. Not a PG rating, G. And it's easily the only film by David Lynch ever get this rating. So a very left turn. And I remember getting a lot of critical success at the time.
Did it? I thought it would just get confused.
I don't think it did a lot of box office success. No, but people liked it. After this, he made Lost Highway. This is now going back into the craziness of David Lynch. Bill Pullman's in it, and Patricia Arquette, who is amazing. I rewatched this week, and I'm like, oh my God, Patricia Arquette was so good, man. She is a great actress. And you see what she does now in this movie versus in Severance, and it's like, this is like, it's obviously they're completely different characters. She knows what she's doing, man. She's a great actress. And of course, there's like a body switching thing that happens, and again, it's very strange. There's mystery involved. This guy's at the beginning, he's trying to figure out why people are leaving these video cassette packages at his house and what is going on. So there's a mystery and you're trying to figure it out. I won't ruin this movie if people haven't seen it, but I watched him like, what is this movie about? Which is what you think after you watch David Lynch movies. And then he'll always give you a hint in subsequent interviews. This Lost Highway was made around the time of O.J. Simpson. And he thought to himself, how can someone be accused of murder, likely have committed murder, and just go golfing with his buddies and just, happy-go-lucky and like shaking people's hands, signing autographs, and just, how can they just go about it? And maybe they recreate the narrative in their mind of what happened and what the events that led up to, the horrific crime you created. Maybe that's the only way you can live with it, is by recreating the past in a way that you find more palatable. I'm paraphrasing Lynch, but that's what he thinks. So when you know that, again, I'm not going to ruin this movie for you, and it is very strange, but when you see that, you're like, okay, I kind of get what's going on here. And this idea of, body switching, trying to conceptualize something that's happened to you is also the theme of Mulholland Drive. Mulholland Drive, Ali, it's not just my favorite David Lynch movie, it's one of my favorite movies I've ever seen in my life.
Really? I really do love it. I've never ranked it
much.
like that, but man, it's really good.
So what happened with this movie was, and sorry, I know I'm talking a lot, I just love this movie so much. He got the green light from ABC to make a new TV show that was going to be kind of Mulholland Drive. So he did a 2-hour pilot, and then it was taking a long time. It cost lots of money. Production was running behind. So they basically said, forget it. We're not making this TV show. So then he had this 2-hour thing he's already filmed. So he got $7 million from Studio Canal. I'm sure you know Studio Canal, the big French production company.
Sure.
And they completed it as the film. And it's really what it's trying to talk about in this movie is, and you get this after repeated watchings and reading some interviews with Lynch and opinions online. It's about the dark side of Hollywood and the disillusionment of Hollywood and the idea of what you have to do to be a star and what you have to compromise from that. It is like Naomi Watts is in this and you're like, you are a star. It's obvious you're a star. This was it. And you read, there's a very touching thing she wrote about David Lynch about how like he saw something in her that she just didn't know she had, right? It's really touching. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. What do you think of this movie?
Big fan, man. Big fan. This was his, finally, this was his box office success and critical success. And Roger Ebert finally came around, right? He said his quote from his review here, at last his experiment, meaning David Lynch's experiment, doesn't shatter the test tubes. The movie is a surrealist dreamscape in the form of a Hollywood film noir, and the less sense it makes, the more we can't stop watching. And I thought that was very interesting.
That is an amazing quote by Roger Ebert. I love Roger Ebert. I wasn't aware of that quote, but it encapsulates exactly what I love about David Lynch. So many artists, whether they're visual artists, musical artists, filmmakers, they'll try to do surrealism. They'll try to do abstract. And I'm like, this makes no sense. And more importantly, getting back to what my friend had texted me this week, you don't have a connection with the characters. There's no empathy with the characters. You don't relate to what's going on. To merge these two things, to have stuff, I didn't know what Mulholland Drive meant when I watched it. This is years of reading. I've come to this conclusion. I may be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But to not know what's going on, to find this so strange and weird, but to love every second of it and to feel what's going on with the characters, no one else has done this, in my opinion, in film. And so that's why I like it so much, because of exactly what Roger Ebert said.
Yeah, it really reminds me of, on a very personal note here, I speak Punjabi at like a grade 3 level, which means that when I listen to Punjabi music, I understand every, 7th, 8th word. And when I understand those, I can't necessarily, I can't fully understand what's being said. But that music and just those little bit of words still make me feel something visceral. And I felt the exact same thing, like with David Lynch work, you go, okay, I don't know exactly what's happening, but I understand something about films. I understand something about directing and acting. And I'm getting enough of this that I just want to keep consuming it. And maybe I'll understand it fully. Maybe I won't, but I'm along for the ride. It really was something I'd be tempted to also say this might be one of my top 10 movies. An interesting thing about David Lynch also is that, if you look at his movie making, you might think he's a reclusive weirdo of some kind. He's actually regarded as this internet pioneer, very connected to digital landscape, capitalized on the popularity of the internet as it was first coming up, used it as a distribution channel. He released a new series that he created exclusively on his website, like something I still can't do to this day on my website. David Lynch was already doing in the early 2000s. He had a bunch of shorts that he created, a surreal sitcom he did, this Japanese style horror short. He was just like, yeah, if you like me, here's where you can come find some of my material for free or for very little. It's crazy.
And of course, he was also the bartender, Gus, on the Cleveland Show, I guess, which was the Family Guy spinoff. I watched like 2 episodes of Cleveland Show. And it's just funny he decided to do that. But he then went on just recently, about 5 years or so ago. It was Showtime in the US. They gave him money to make a 3rd season of Twin Peaks. It's called Twin Peaks The Return, is how most people refer to it. It takes place 25 years after the cliffhanger that ended the original series. I won't spoil that for people who don't know what happened. But Special Agent Cooper is trapped in a very strange place that he has to escape. And meanwhile, he has a doppelganger running around. Meanwhile, things have moved on with the people of Twin Peaks, so you catch up with them. And of course, there's some other murders and mysterious things going on that brings back FBI Director Gordon Cole, who was played by David Lynch.
Tell me this. Oh, yeah, right. The reception of this, was it like Arrested Development, Beloved, and then season 4 comes out and people go, why did you do that?
No, absolutely not. It was a really good point. I don't know how many people watch this. I can't even describe this. It's so out there, but some of the scenes are just burned into my brain. Does it make sense? A lot of times, no. And Kyle MacLachlan should have won the Best Actor Emmy that year. He has to play 2 different characters acting completely different. One guy who has no memories and acts kind of like a child. It's one of the best things I've ever seen. He is so good in this, but this has a 94% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. And, I'll tell you some of the other reviews. Sean Collins from Rolling Stone says it's one of the most groundbreaking TV series ever made. And Matt Zoller Seitz from Vulture says it was the most original and disturbing show to hit TV since The Sopranos. And it's true. And Jim Jarmusch, famous director, said it's a masterpiece, the single best piece of American cinema of the preceding 10 years. Why did he say that? Because it's actually one 18-hour movie. The breaks between the episodes are quite arbitrary. It is well. So when I talk about one of my favorite movies ever, as you said, my top 10 is Mulholland Drive. When I talk about one of my favorite TV series ever, Ali, I'm talking up there with Arrested Development, Seinfeld, Breaking Bad. It's this Twin Peaks: The Return. It is No one could
Wow.
make something like this. No one will ever make something like this. It is definitely not for everybody. It's so out there and surreal, but I loved every single minute of watching it. It was great.
As I'm looking up David Lynch this week, I also find out something I didn't know about him, which is his connection to literature. He wrote a short book, which is like more in line with that straight movie than it is with his surrealism. The book's called Catching the Big Fish, Meditation, Consciousness, and Creativity. It's a non-linear book that, things he's realized from transcendental meditation, TM, stories from his career, his creative process. And I thought this was very interesting, man. He describes the metaphor behind the title, Catching the Big Fish, in the introduction. And the introduction goes like this: ideas are like fish. If you want to catch little fish, you can stay in the shallow water. But if you want to catch the big fish, you've got to go deeper, down deep. The fish are more powerful and more pure. They're huge and abstract, and they're very beautiful. And knowing the work that he's done, it's just, I don't know, it's much more powerful than if anyone else said it, right? Like his
Absolutely.
Eraserhead, his first thing that gained any notoriety, that's like the way to look at it is not out there, but down deep.
Yeah,
Down
that's where you
deep,
had to
huge
go
and
to get this.
abstract. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's just, in the last few minutes of this section, talk about his legacy. Honestly, I mean, you kind of know how I feel about this. To me, the past 50 years of cinema, there are three greats: Spielberg, Scorsese, and David Lynch. That's it for me. And of course, it always takes their passing to make you think about this. Some of the other quotes about his legacy: in 2007, a panel of critics convened by The Guardian said that after their discussion, they came to the conclusion that David Lynch is the most important filmmaker of the current era. And Pauline Kael, who's one of the most famous film critics, said he's the first populist surrealist. And that's what I was getting at before. How could you do both? Make commercially successful films and be so surreal? Like, he did it somehow.
It's interesting because we've talked about this on the podcast, that as you have tech companies that own movie studios, you will no longer have certain types of movies. You'll never see another Taxi Driver. You'll never see another, like, I don't know, Memento, or these kind of, like, it's all going to be lost. But maybe we'll still see David Lynch films, given that he was commercially successful, but also
I don't know. I hope
there,
he
as
can
you say.
influence other filmmakers. I don't think there will be another person like him. I don't think it's possible. And if you read the praise and the memorials to him from people like Spielberg and Scorsese, they're like, they're saying he was a visionary. They're saying he was the most unique voice in cinema. So what do you say to that, right?
Kyle MacLachlan, we mentioned numerous times because he worked with him so often. He wrote, in his tribute to him after he passed, he said, "I always found him to be the most authentically alive person I'd ever met. His love for me and mine for him came out of the cosmic fate of two people who saw the best things about themselves in each other." It's very sad. "I will miss him more than the limits of my language can tell and my heart can bear. My world is that much fuller because I knew him, and that much emptier now that he's gone." One of the most beautiful things I've read in a
Very
long time.
sad. We'll leave this section on a slightly more happy note because it is very sad. But, Spielberg cast Lynch as John Ford in The Fabelmans. And if you haven't seen The Fabelmans, it's okay, but you could find this scene online. Just rewatch it the other day. So The Fabelmans is kind of the story of Spielberg growing up and discovering his love as a young person of film. And in the last scene of the movie, he gets a job working on a set with a production company, and he gets to meet John Ford, who is, at that time, probably the most famous and revered Hollywood director. Interestingly, this scene is apparently word for word exactly what happened when Spielberg met Ford. And also interesting, David Lynch actually had met and knew John Ford. So Spielberg asked David Lynch to play John Ford in this scene because he's like, well, you could actually play a person who you knew. And it's all about, I won't ruin the scene for you, it's all about perspective of where the camera sits. And David Lynch is hilarious in it. He captures John Ford amazingly well. And in fact, this is the best scene in the movie. So you don't have to watch the whole movie. I'm just telling you. And this is actually what I would have liked more of the movie, more of this learning about the inside of cinema from the cinema greats that Spielberg was exposed to early in his career. That's much more interesting what the movie's actually about. But if you want to watch that, just look up final scene in The Fabelmans, and you'll see David Lynch's last screen performance, which is absolutely amazing.
Okay. So in August 2024, David Lynch made it public that he had been diagnosed with emphysema, which he attributed to his years of smoking, and he could no longer leave his house. He told People magazine he quit smoking in 2022, having first started when he was 8 years old, and he said he was reliant on supplemental oxygen for most daily activities and could hardly walk across a room. This obviously struck a chord with me. The last year of my father's life was very, very similar to that. So I thought, let's talk about emphysema and talk about what it means. Also, what my father had was pulmonary fibrosis. So I'd love to know the relationship between the two. He also required supplemental oxygen and also was struggling to be, he needed an oxygen tank to be out of the house. But emphysema, yeah, it's sort of something that is commonly mentioned. I'm not sure how well it's understood. I think there's some value in talking about what it is how common it is, what causes it, how you can avoid it, and all the rest of it. So let's get into it. What is emphysema?
Yeah, so it's basically a progressive lung disease. The umbrella term is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, which I think a lot of people have heard of. Very common. And COPD comprises chronic bronchitis and emphysema. So we're just going to be talking about the emphysema aspect of it. But as you said, smoking, which we'll get into, is a very common cause of it. And I'm saying that because I know your dad smoked.
Oh, yeah.
For most of his life. And one of the other conditions that can develop with smoking is this pulmonary fibrosis. So that's a bit of a different kind of disease, but will also result in you needing oxygen and decreased lung capacity. So the emphysema is caused by exposure to either noxious particles or gases. So it can be like environmental exposures and things like that from certain jobs and toxins you get exposed to, but really it's from smoking is the most common cause. And so you basically get difficulties in your airway that limit the airflow. I'm simplifying this quite a bit. And you get destruction of the distal parts. So not the upper part of your airway, but the bottom part of your lungs. And you get damage to these areas. And you get this dilatation or expansion of these air spaces. And that results in difficulties exchanging gas and oxygen and basically lead to all these symptoms.
Okay, so I guess its commonality is linked to cigarette smoking in any country, in any region. And the less people smoke, the less emphysema we'll see, possibly?
Right, exactly. So 80 to 90% of patients with COPD, remember the bigger umbrella term, are cigarette smokers, and 10 to 15% of cigarette smokers develop COPD, which seems low to me. You think more people would develop it, but again, you have to smoke a certain amount. And so smoking is like the main cause of it. There are some rare genetic causes. There's something called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, which can also cause it, but that's like a small, like 1 to 2% of cases. So the vast majority is caused by smoking.
And what are the symptoms? How do you know when you have emphysema or when you better get yourself checked out?
Yeah, so it will start kind of, with very non-specific symptoms like you're short of breath, you're coughing. You could have sputum or like, do you know what I mean when I say sputum? Like coughing up mucus or whatever.
Yes.
But it doesn't have to be. And then it slowly will worsen. More and more shorter breath, more and more coughing. And then you have what's called exertional dyspnea. So any type of movement, it could be exercising, but eventually it's going to be even just walking. You're going to have shortness of breath and difficulty breathing. And then you can get wheezing because of the obstruction of the airflow. And then eventually, people will lose a lot of weight because your body is working so hard just to breathe.
And how is it diagnosed?
So it's often a clinical diagnosis. So the doctor will just wonder if this may be what you have based on the fact that you may have a history of cigarette smoking, the shortness of breath. but they might do what's called pulmonary function tests. Have you ever seen someone have this, Ali, or have you ever had this done yourself?
I don't think I have. No.
So basically, they give you a device and you breathe out into it. And depending on what they see with the different patterns, they can figure out what kind of lung disease you can have. So they'll do it for asthma, and they'll have you do that before and after taking a puffer to see whether that will help or not. But the main thing they use for COPD and emphysema is what's called the FEV1, which is called the forced expiratory volume, which is the amount of air that you exhale. So they have you exhale into this device in 1 second. And they compare you to normal, quote unquote, normal people who don't have any lung disease and see what their level would be, predicted level based on your age and a couple other factors.
That's interesting. Why 1 second? I would think it's a measure of your lung capacity, so you need to know how much you can take in, how much you can blow out, but
Good
why
point.
1 second?
It's because what people have with these dilation, with the emphysema, is they have obstructive problems. That's why it's called obstructive pulmonary disease, right? So it's difficulty getting the air out in these patients. There's other diseases which will cause you difficulty getting the air in. Or there's other ones which will have difficulty with you, as you're saying, expelling your total volume of air. You can never get rid of all the air in your lungs. That's a bit of a misnomer. It's impossible to really do that. But that's a different measurement that you'll use it. So the different measurements can be linked to different diseases. So it's a really good question. But for this one, it happens to do with what you can expel very quickly in that first second. So if you have like 80% of the FEV1 compared to the general population, that's mild. Less than 80, so 50 to 80 is moderate, 50 to 30 is severe, and then very severe, the most severe kind is less than 30% are predicted. And so you can kind of grade it based on that.
I get the feeling there's no cure for emphysema,
Correct.
but what is the variety of treatment that can maybe help or
I don't know, you can maybe modify the disease process. So the first thing is to take medicine, so different kinds of puffers, right? And there's different kinds. There's beta agonists, which is the typical like Ventolin kind of puffer. There's other ones that are what are called anticholinergic medications. So they alter the muscle tone in the lungs to allow you to breathe better and improve your exercise tolerance. So you'll take those. You can also take inhaled corticosteroids. Some people will take them for asthma. Some people will take them in their nose, like an intranasal steroid. So it's that. So you might be used for those. If you have you can get very severe exacerbations in emphysema and COPD. If you have one of those, you might have to come into the hospital and they'll give you IV steroids for those. There's also a medicine called an oral phosphodiesterase inhibitor that you can take as well.
What about oxygen? Where does that factor into treatment, or is that just for survival?
I mean, I guess, it's to keep your oxygen levels up. So that is something that's commonly prescribed is oxygen. And as you mentioned, with your father and with David Lynch, some people are completely oxygen dependent on it. They have to walk around with it all the time. It's just so interesting. Now I'm thinking about this. Remember in Blue Velvet, when we talked about Dennis Hopper's character with the gas mask all the time? Yeah. And then, of course, this is where David Lynch ended up, right? With a mask, an oxygen mask. You can also get what's called non-invasive positive pressure ventilation. And you may know this from when we talked about obstructive sleep apnea before. People wear those CPAP machines. So you can wear something similar to help with your breathing with emphysema. Then they can actually do, this is commonly prescribed, so it's not all medicine. They can also do something called pulmonary rehab, and that's often prescribed with people. So it's basically to give people more education about their lungs, the disease they have, what causes you to have shortness of breath, and exercises you can do to help with that. And it's also done usually in a group setting with peers to help people become more aware. They can help support each other. And they really want to improve your level of fitness, improve your lung health as much as possible, so you can actually just tolerate more time without getting short of breath, without needing oxygen, teach you how to conserve energy, improve your stamina, and just improve well-being overall. So that's an important thing. I didn't really know about that. We certainly didn't learn about that when I learned about this in medical school like over 20 years ago. This pulmonary rehab was not a thing that they would teach you about. But from my reading in preparation for this episode, it's used more and more.
David Lynch was diagnosed in 2022, died within a few years. How does that work? When we're talking about prognosis, is it different for everybody? Your life expectancy depends on how much you smoked and
Yeah, it depends on that. It depends on, obviously if you quit smoking and adopted a healthier lifestyle, that can prolong your life. The number of years you smoked and the number of packs per day you smoked plays a huge role in that, right? If you're an infrequent smoker, it's not going to be the same as someone who smoked multiple packs a day. And then it depends on which stage. Remember I said with the FEV1, there was the mild 80%, and then we went down to the more severe using that pulmonary function test. So depending on that, so just to look at the extremes, the stage 1 would be those people who have the mild lung disease, over 80%. Those people might only get shorter breath with strenuous activity. It might be okay. Their life expectancy is normal at that time. So then you really want people to quit smoking, take some of those medicines, exercise all the time, right? To kind of maintain that. But then you can think there's a gradation, right? And as you get down to those people with a very severe stage of emphysema, stage 4, they have very low lung function. This is like less than 30% of what other people their age would have. They need usually supplemental oxygen all the time. Can't really function, do any of their activities of daily living. So cooking, dressing, whatever is difficult because you get so short of breath. And then your life expectancy is significantly reduced months to years if you get to that stage. And again, we don't know. We're not the physicians for David Lynch, but if you're saying it's 2022 and then basically he passes away in early 2025, that's not a long time. So he was probably at one of these more severe stages before he passed away.
The idea that he started smoking at age 8 would certainly suggest, I don't know how many times he quit in between, but 8 is something. I've heard about 8 with, people who grew up in the Philippine jungles. Yeah. And then David Lynch. 8 is that's significant. Maybe that reflects the Philadelphia community he lived in too, right? And it's rare to see a photo of him without a cigarette in his hand, right? And so it was part of his life. He acknowledges this. He said, yeah, I did that. I smoked, and this is the consequence. So I'll link to a People article, which was actually from around the time he came out and said that he had this emphysema. And you can see, I think he took it stoically, but it is obviously like the contributor to him passing away. So that's our episode for today. Let us know what you guys thought. Our deep dive into David Lynch in memory of his life and career. Really, I don't know what else to say. I'm a huge fan. You can tell Ali is too. Let us know what you guys thought. drvcomedian@gmail.com. drvcomedian on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky. We're everywhere. Of course, the TikTok ban keeps coming and going. Who knows what's going on? Should we be on TikTok? I don't know. I think we should probably leave Twitter, to be honest with you, Ali, but I don't know what to say. Ali, what do you got going on the first couple of weeks of February? Anything happening in your life? Very much so. I'll be on the road in the west coast of Canada. I'll be in Maple Ridge, BC, home of famed baseball player, Expos player Larry Walker. That's very inside baseball, if you will. I'll be in Nelson, BC, place that I love, and I'll be in Edmonton. Edmonton almost sold out. We might add another show. And at Ottawa. Ottawa twice. I'm opening for Maz Jobrani in Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto. And then I'm coming to Ottawa Schenkman Center later in February for a Laugh Out Loud CBC recording, which should be a very, very good time. Those tickets are almost sold out too. Oh, yeah. People should get those. Again, like I mentioned on a previous podcast, lots of people asking me about the show. I'm like, you guys got to get your tickets, man. It is selling out fast. 500-seater, popular thing. They have a huge mailing list. So as soon as any show is listed, they go to their massive mailing list, and it's like sort of a built-in audience right there who immediately buy tickets. So that's what you're competing against. Big desire for comedy in Ottawa. Also a big desire for doctors. But remember that although I'm a doctor, I'm not your doctor. Medical issues we talk about are for your interest and information only, and they're not medical advice. Please consult your medical professionals for actual medical advice. Thanks for listening. Bye.